You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano. I'm hosting this program. This program is coming to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. That's 3CR in Melbourne. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. And if you're wondering what anarchism is all about, no, it's not what's not happening in the US of A or Gaza. Anarchism is a simple concept. It's about creating a society without rulers. That's the definition, without rulers. Not without rules. What gives rulers the ability to determine the lives of billions of people, as we're currently seeing? Inequalities in power and wealth. So the anarchist struggles, the struggle to devolve or share power, possibly through direct democratic means, and it's the struggle to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. Motherhood statements. How can people be so negative about an anarchist program? Well, obviously they require leaders to tell them what to do, and then they complain because the rulers and leaders don't do what they're going to say. But that's a different story. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, what a wonderful picture. What a wonderful picture. A marriage made in heaven. A war criminal, the Prime Minister of Israel, Mr. Netanyahu, and a buffoon, the President of the USA, posing for pickies. The buffoon in his blue suit and red tie, and the war criminal in his black suit and red tie. What a lovely picture. When I looked at this marriage made in heaven, I thought to myself, now these are not dictators, although they are acting as dictators, and they're acting as if they've got unlimited power, but these are men who are elected to power by the people in their country. They were elected to power. So what does it say about the land of the brave and the free, the US of A, and the land of the God's chosen people, Israel? What does it really say when they are willing to elect people and elect governments whose programs, political, social, cultural programs, are creating so much chaos and death and misery? Think about it. We all like to carry on about the dictatorship in China and the dictatorship in Russia. But when it comes to our own dictators who have been elected, we seem to be a little bit, we don't seem to be able to criticise. Now, first of all, I'd like to think that possibly that you think that Israel and the USA have become pariah states. Now, the Gaza struggle, or the Palestinian struggle, didn't start on the 7th of October 2023. It started 70 years later, 70 years earlier, not later, earlier, when Palestinians were forcefully displaced from their homelands. What we are seeing in Gaza, and to a lesser extent currently in the West Bank, is nothing short of state terrorism. Nothing more, nothing less. When you have an overwhelming military complex like the Israeli Defence Forces is, unleashing their firepower from the sea, from the air, from the land, on an enclave of 2 million people living in an area, boxed in an area of less than half the size of Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane, you begin to understand the degree of carnage which occurs. This is not a war. This is not a war. This is indiscriminate murder of civilians. Now, I'm not saying Hamas hasn't got a base in Gaza. Obviously, they've got a base in Gaza. But all the current death and destruction, and let's not forget that 70% of the 51,000 Palestinians that have died directly as a result of bombing and shooting are women and children, you begin to see the situation in its true light. And the fact that here in Australia, Gaza, the carnage, the brutality, the indiscriminate slaughter, which is currently occurring as I speak, where 2 million people have been bombed back into the Dark Ages. I mean, the Israeli Defence Forces, those heroes in the Israeli Defence Forces, have been able to do to Gaza what Nixon was not able to do to North Vietnam, where he was going to bomb them back to the Dark Ages in the 60s and early 70s. The pictures which are coming out, and they are still coming out, because of the brave people in Gaza who are trying to show what's actually happening on the ground in that tiny little enclave where you have bombings of food lines, the machine gunning of paramedical personnel, the indiscriminate slaughter. And on top of that, we have now had a 6-week blockade. Food, medicines, fuel, essential services. And while the United Nations does what it can with its limited abilities, we see a war criminal being feted by a buffoon in Washington. And the media falling over themselves to actually put a positive spin on this marriage made in hell, not heaven. Now, I could go on and on and on about the criminality, the collective punishment, the brutality, the unnecessary carnage which is occurring in Gaza. As I said, a little enclave, half the size of Melbourne or Sydney. But I'm not going to. You know what's going on. You can see it with your own eyes. And that's the difference between 100 years ago and today. We can see it with our own eyes. We can see the anguish, the pain, the humiliation. Now, all this is going to do is, one, most likely lead to the death of more of the hostages which have been held by Hamas, and two, it is going to lead to a generation of Palestinians who are young people in their, 10, 15, 12, 13 today, taking up arms against the Israeli state, seeking vengeance for what has occurred. Anybody with half a brain would realise that the solution, and again, this is nothing new, the solution to the carnage is a negotiated settlement. End of story. But here in the West, we have good war criminals and we have bad war criminals. Now, the good war criminal is Mr. Netanyahu and the Israeli Defence Forces, and the bad war criminals are Mr. Putin and the Russian Defence Forces. Okay? Now, it's interesting how the media message is manipulated in both situations. When the Russians are guilty of an atrocity, we hear all about that atrocity, and we should hear about that atrocity because it is an atrocity. But we never hear about a Russian response. Now, when the Israeli Defence Forces is guilty of an atrocity, we hear about the atrocity, and then we hear we're bombarded with the Israeli propaganda about how that atrocity, which we have seen with our own eyes, is totally justified. Don't look. Move on. Nothing to see here. Move on. Nothing to see here. What we are seeing in Gaza is something that has not occurred since the Pol Pot regime unleashed a reign of terror on its own people, since the Holocaust, when the Nazi Party unleashed a reign of terror on Jewish people, as we saw in Vietnam during the war, which was pushed by the United States of America, where over 3 million Vietnamese died and almost 50,000 Americans died. This is, as the United Nations General Secretary has said, totally untenable, and there will be consequences in the future. There will be consequences. And all I can say to the people of the United States and Israel, not that anybody would be interested in what I have to say or what you have to say, and that's the dilemma, is that you elected these people. You put them in power. You knew their policies. And now is the time to take the streets in the hundreds of thousands, in the millions, to put a brake on what's happening in both of these pariah states. You're listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Well, did you get excited last night? Were you excited? Did you pay for the privilege of being excited? Well, I'm talking about the debate between the Prime Minister of Australia, Mr Albanese, and the Prime Minister in waiting, Mr Dutton. You know, fine. They trundled on about this and that. I watched a bit of it on free-to-air TV. But can you imagine? Here we have the Prime Minister in waiting, the Prime Minister debating, each other on Sky News, Rupert Murdoch's cesspool of misinformation, disinformation. Here they are debating with a screen behind them advertising Sky News, the very organisation which has been responsible for the rise of the buffoon, Buffalini in the US of A, and we're expected to pay for the privilege because the first debate was on pay TV. Can you really imagine this? Because it was real. I mean, have we stooped so low in this society that we need to have debates which have a direct influence on the electoral outcome in this society, with an election on the 3rd of May, broadcast, organised, massaged, promoted by that cesspool of misinformation and disinformation, Sky News? What an extraordinary situation we find ourselves in 2025. Wouldn't it nice to have the debate, middle of nowhere, few cameras, bang, extraordinary. What an extraordinary situation we find ourselves in. Now, I am sure nobody listening to The Anarchist World This Week, I hope I'm right, would have seen the debate on Sky News. Well, how do I know all about it? Well, I watched it on free-to-air, little clips which are allowed to be seen, which promoted Sky News on free-to-air TV. Such is life in Australia during the deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation cesspool we find ourselves in. And talking about cesspools, look at the buffoon. Right? Look, I can understand imposing tariffs. I understand. Right? The whole Australian debate since Federation has been between the free traders and the protectionists. And if you look at history since 1901 to 2025, it's been this big debate. And obviously the free traders have had the floor for the last 50 years, or 30 years. But what an extraordinary display of ignorance and stupidity. He comes out with a little board, tells us the penguins in the Antarctic need to pay tariffs. What are they going to do? Surrender their eggs? Telling us that the evil people on Norfolk Island, which isn't an independent sovereign nation state, not that I expect him to know that, need to pay tariffs, but they keep telling me they don't export anything to the USA. And then, although Australia has a trade surplus, that means more American shit comes into this country than Australian shit goes to America, we still get a 10% impost as far as tariffs is concerned. And everybody in the country is screaming blue murder. Blue murder. Now we've got three options. Every sovereign nation state on planet Earth has three options. They can acquiesce to the imperial demands of the buffoon and pick up the phone and organise a little meeting with the buffoon and actually negotiate on the tariffs. Now, I understand that the buffoon's media people are saying that 70 nation states have picked up the phone because they want to negotiate with the United States of America. Guess what? I don't believe a word they say. Or you can be like the Chinese government, which has nothing to lose in the long run, standing up, saying, sorry, we're not going to be blackmailed by you, boy. And that's the key, boy. We're not going to be blackmailed by you. So if you want 104% tariffs, we'll have 104% tariffs. Because, see, what we've forgotten is that we live on planet Earth. Planet Earth has 8 billion people. Now, planet Earth consists of 5 continents. The USA takes up about, maybe 25% of the American continent, maybe less, 20%. And it has about 320 million people, although Mr. Trump, I use the word, I will wash out my mouth with soap and water when I, get off the air in about half an hour's time. I will wash out my mouth with soap and water. I used the T word. I am so sorry. Now, the buffoon, right, thinks that the USA, he'd like to see a few less Americans, in inverted commas, because a lot of them are immigrants and they've been shipped out, all right? He's forgotten who does the low-paid shit work in the US of A. So here we have 8 billion people on the planet. Now, most of these people will be affected by the tariffs. And on the other side, we have about 320, 330 million people. Now, obviously, in the industrialised world, this will have an impact. But let's not forget, there are many European nation states. There's the Chinese nation state, and there's many other nation states around the world today which produce goods. And if the buffoon in the White House thinks that somehow the United States of America, a failing empire, thinks that the world needs the crap they make, they need to think again. Now, in little old Australia, we think we need that stuff. They're computers. They're computers. I like that. They're planes. They're trucks. Well, the fact is, you can buy computers and planes and trucks from other parts of the world. So what am I doing personally? What am I doing? Well, I'm one of 8 billion. So obviously it's a minuscule drop in the ocean. But personally, what I'm doing regarding all this kerfuffle, it's causing a little bit of concern in the world and in Australia as our political leaders grapple with the fact of what they're going to do. Are they going to grovel? Are they going to, say, piss off? Or are they going to try to ignore it as we do in this country? We thought, well, if we ignore it, maybe they'll go away. We grovel and ignore it, well, they'll go away. Well, here's a few little lessons. A few lessons you can do. These are things you can personally do. It won't cost you anything. It may actually even improve your health. You can stop buying crap from American companies that have got subsidiaries in this country. You don't have to go and buy a coffee in an American subsidiary. You don't have to buy your hamburger or your chips in an American subsidiary. You don't have to go on Netflix and give money to American company. You don't have to buy through Amazon. And if by some chance you've got the disposable income to buy a truck or a computer, you don't have to buy something made in the United States of America. And we've got a trade surplus and we treat it like shit. Extraordinary. You know why? Because they want to interfere, like an imperial power. They want to interfere in the internal decisions that are made in this country. Decisions regarding biological security. They want to export their beef into Australia, irrespective of the biological hazards. They want to destroy the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, because what happens with the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, you've got a sovereign nation state, Australia, negotiating with big pharmacy, and their profit margins drop. They want to interfere. In the good old days, they'd send in the armed forces. Look at all the coups and counter-coups in America and Africa, which were bankrolled by the United States of America. But those days are now gone, because the people of the United States no longer want to fight other people's wars in other countries. Those days are gone. So the buffoon and all the cohorts, in the American Congress and Senate who support the buffoon, somehow think by waving the economic whip that people will buckle. Not everything is a transactional end game. There are things beyond money. Sorry to take up the National Australia Bank's slogan, beyond money. A bit of a laugh there. There are things beyond money. There are things like national pride. I mean, the Chinese, in various forms, their governments have been around for 5,000 years. United States government's less than 250 years old. Do you think they're going to say, oh, yes, Mr. President, we'll come and negotiate? And there are many other sovereign nation states like Canada which have stood up to the buffoon. And even Mexico, a country which is almost totally dependent on the US economy, is some degree standing up. So which side are we going to be on? So look, I recommend that you look at your purchases. Look at who you're dealing with. And remove yourself from any American or any USA-owned corporation that is in this country or you need to interact with in order to buy products, because that's what they rely on. They rely on your money. And every time you go to an American film, every time you go to a coffee shop owned by an American company, every time you buy from Amazon, every time, you go into pay TV, all the various networks, there are networks that are not necessarily controlled or owned by the US of A. And it won't take long for the buffoon to realise that his own people begin to turn on him. You see, the buffoon, the President of the United States of America, has got great similarities to somebody who was, pushing the same agenda 100 years ago. Mr. Mussolini, El Duce, who seized power in 1921. Well, El Duce was a dictator. He seized power. As I said before at the beginning of the program, these are not dictators. They've been elected into power by the people. They rule. It is a bit funny when you think about it. It's tragic, but it's also funny. Well, he came to a sticky end because the people turned against him, because the policies that were being pushed were policies which were basically against their national interests. So let's not worry about it. I mean, it's a bit of a joke when you really think about it. Well, it may not be a joke, but it can be a joke because I'm sure the Chinese Premier, I'm sure he's thinking, like I think it was Holmes a Court fought when Bond was forced to sell his assets in the 1980s in West Australia for 10% of their value. He must think, you only get one buffoon in one lifetime. And I can see it. See, the thing is, this is bad for the USA. Now, I'm sure there are millions of decent, hard-working people who believed that they were doing the right thing for their country when they believed the rhetoric of a billionaire who doesn't pay tax, is responsible for so many bankruptcies, it's unknown, is a convicted felon. They thought, let's give this system a shake-up. Little did they understand that shake-up meant them suffering. You listen to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. My name is Joseph Toscano. I'm hosting this program. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au, 3cr.org.au. You can leave messages on 0439 395 489, 0439 395 489. What else? YouTube channels, public interest before corporate interests. Joseph Toscano got known. Facebook page, Joseph Toscano, Toscano for Flinders. The list goes on and on. The reality is that, there's a lot of stuff out there, but very few feet on the ground. And that's the issue in the 21st century. A lot of, keyboard warriors, social activists, people in the virtual sphere, but not enough people in the real world. And that's the dilemma that activists face in the 21st century. Let's move on. Superannuation. the retirement plans on a knife edge. You see, those regular listeners to the Anarchist World this week know that what I think about superannuation. I'll go through it again because repetition, in case we've got new listeners. Look, superannuation is the biggest con job that's been foisted on the Australian people. And I'll go through it again. Now, theoretically, employers put aside, I think it's 10.5%, it'll be 12% in a few weeks, of a worker's wage into a superannuation fund. And the purpose of that superannuation fund is to pay for the retirement of that particular worker. Okay, now the first thing I mentioned is the word worker. Now, superannuation is a con for a variety of reasons. Instead of relying on the state to look after us in our old age with a reasonable pension or through a universal basic income, we now have to save to pay for our own old age. That's the philosophy. We save to pay for our old age. You like that? Now, it gets better. If you're not part of the workforce and pay, income tax, you get no superannuation. So if you're an individual who's made the decision, whether you're male or female, has made a decision to look after your children, and one partner goes to work and one partner looks after the children, and you may take 10 years out of your working life, out of wage slavery, wage drudgery, no superannuation. If you get sick, no superannuation. If you lose your job, no superannuation. And the beauty, this is what I really love about our superannuation system. If you're a decent, hard-working Australian who pays their taxes and obeys the law and gets an average wage, you will find at the end of a working life of 40 or 50 or even 60 years that the amount of money that's accumulated in your superannuation fund will not cover your retirement. But more importantly, if your wages are low, the balance in your superannuation account is low. If you earn lots of money and you're a CEO or earn lots of money, the amount of money in your superannuation account at the end of your working life is extraordinarily good, and you can actually live the life of Riley. So the poor don't have enough superannuation. The rich rely on taxation laws which make contributions to your superannuation funds and almost a tax minimisation mechanism. So how's that fair? And then, this is what I really love, and this is the point I'm trying to come to. Over the last week, because of the buffoon's stupidity, right, if you got money in a managed superannuation fund, or if you've got a self-managed fund and you have a lot of money in the stock market, and let's not forget 40 cents in every dollar which is invested in the Australian stock market comes from superannuation funds, you may have seen your little nest egg decrease by 10%, maybe 15%, maybe 5%. The issue isn't, we all know about stock market gyrations and the fact that putting money in stock markets, whether it's Australian stock markets or the US stock markets, there are many issues. But the issue is the volatility, the fact there is no certainty in old age. And I know many people who rely on their superannuation who are totally freaked out every time there's some gyrations on the world stock markets. Because it is not It's not a stable way of actually looking after your old age. And let's not forget the 1/3 of Australians, I forgot. You know, what do you expect from an old person? I forgot that 1/3 of Australians rely on unemployment benefits, social security benefit, old age pensions, disability pensions, and they don't get any superannuation. So, biggest con since the buffoon was elected to the USA, to the presidency. Think about it. So as you see your superannuation fund fluctuate, think about the fact that your future in retirement is totally dependent on a marketplace that is based on a private investment for private profit mantra. You're listening to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Now, I want to speak about the new rebel, the unforgotten rebel. And this is the rebel that has kind of been responsible for the rise of the buffoons of the world. And I can understand why. And we never speak about this. We like to think of people, as stupid and ignorant. But people react to the situation they find themselves in. And if they think they've been humiliated or treated unfairly, they'll react in various ways. And cynicism and despair is part of that reactions that we see. The type of reactions people in authority love to see in the community. Cynicism and despair, because they're the aphrodisiac of those who exercise power. You're cynical, you despair, you don't think change is possible. They rub their hands in glee and say, watch them fight among themselves for the crumbs brushed off the corporate table. All right? So the new rebel, and it's the majority of the population. We have a forgotten majority, hemmed in by Neo-Liberalism and identity politics. We've got this huge group of people, not just in this country but around the world, who are hemmed in by Neo-Liberalism and identity politics, who feel totally alienated from society. And these are the type of people who would vote for Mr. Dutton or who would vote for the buffoon who's currently in the White House in Washington. These are the people. This is the forgotten majority. People who work hard, pay their taxes, obey the law, and are treated as total losers by the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. All those neoliberal changes in terms of deregulation and globalisation and corporatisation and privatisation were meant to benefit the majority. They didn't benefit the majority. They pauperised the majority. Not in terms of, finding yourself in Gaza where you can't even get access to food or medicines, but in terms of being in debt up to your neck, trying to pay off a home, trying to pay off a HECS debt, trying to pay off escalating bills for essential services. This is the majority. So neoliberalism has delivered nothing. Minuscule gains to the majority. Well, maybe they could buy more crap. But in the majority of cases just means more debt. So we have the majority of Australians up to their neck in debt, trying to pay for essential things like healthcare, education, roof over your head, the list goes on and on, rent. And then we have identity politics. Now, identity politics have been an important way that minorities have achieved or are trying to achieve a little bit of equality in society. That's what identity politics is about. But when identity politics is seen as the reason for the situation the majority find themselves in, then we have that situation where hate and division becomes an ingrained ingredient of the society we live in. And I see a lot of people. I don't just hang around, people with similar ideas. I see a lot of people. And I see this increasing hatred and derision towards identity politics in the community. And it's not the fact that people somehow need to blame somebody. It's very easy to blame somebody who's been able to acquire a few rights through struggle and protest. It's a lot harder to see where the real issues lie. And the real issues lie, and the majority is pauperised financially because of the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. And for the fact that our parliamentary representatives are more frightened of the 1% than the people they represent. And that's why you find over and over again that many of the problems we face, which we should never face in a society as rich as Australia, occur with monotonous regularity. Now, I can open my mouth as much as I like, but the fact is, you don't judge a person or a movement by their words. Talk is cheap. You judge a person or a movement by their actions. And when I was invited a few weeks ago by some people in the Flinders electorate, a blue ribbon electorate, to see if I was willing to stand as a candidate in the electorate of Flinders, which is a very nice electorate, Bayside electorate, a lot of problems. I said, well, if you can obtain enough people in your electorate to nominate me, I will stand. Now, my nomination is now successful. I'm now a candidate in the electorate of Flinders, which is a blue ribbon seat. So why am I bothered? Why have I put my money where my mouth is, around $10,000, to conduct this campaign? I'm not asking for any financial contributions from anybody. Why? Because you've got to put your money where your mouth is in life. You've got to put your head above the parapet. You've got to put your head. If you don't put your head above the parapet, you're just part of the Gunner tribe, or somebody should do something about that tribe. So why? You think I'm going to be elected? Of course not. You need $1 million to conduct a good campaign in any House of Representatives electorate. Do I think I can get some ideas across? Yes. Because we are in a state of flux. And although a lot of people may not actually be able to point the finger at what actually ails them in terms of the situation they find themselves in, people are looking for credible alternatives. And that's the key, credible alternatives. Now, I have a snowflake's chance in hell of being elected. All right? I know that. So people say, why bother? Well, I bother in order to put new ideas into the community. Not ideas that are mine, but ideas that should be discussed, but are never discussed. When I first saw a private charity ask for money to send Australian children to public schools I had tears in my eyes. And I normally don't have tears in my eyes, I can assure you of that. And I thought to myself, have we come to this? Have the world's richest sovereign nation state on planet Earth need charities to raise money to send Australian kids to public schools? And the question is, why? And it's about revenue, isn't it? We have a goods and services tax which affects everybody. But do we have any financial transaction taxes? And part of the platform I'm running on is introducing a 1% financial transaction tax on any transaction over $5,000. Ka-ching, straight into the Treasury. You could raise $140 billion a year. A 1% stock market turnover tax. Bingo. Another 30 to 40 million. And then the most glaring example of the reason we find ourselves in this situation as Australians is the fact that the manna under the gum trees, the manna under the eucalypts, is given away by successive federal governments and state governments to corporations who pay minimal taxation, in some cases no taxation, and acquire an extraordinary amount of wealth for their major shareholders at the expense of First Nations Australians who continue in many situations to live in third world conditions. And the rest of us, we have extraordinary reserves of bauxite, iron ore, bauxite, iron ore, gems, diamonds, opals, gold. And gold is very important in times of uncertainty, as the value is almost up to 5,000 Australian dollars per ounce of gold. Don't forget that Peter Costello sold it for $200 per ounce, but that's a different story. I won't go into poor old Peter. I assume he's enjoying his superannuation these days. And why shouldn't he? Now, coal, I know it's a dirty thing, but still being mined. Uranium, still being mined. You name it, we've got it. Rare earths, that's the big thing these days. Copper, zinc, silver. And what do? We give it away. Give it away for a peppercorn return in taxes and royalties. Extraordinary. I'm proposing that we nationalise. And if you're going to tell me it's unconstitutional to nationalise without compensation, well, what you do is you do what the buffoon does. 90% tax on turnover. Bang, they'll go bankrupt and then you take it over. Simple. What else? A universal basic income. I know a few people are raising the issue of universal basic income, but think about it. We have 8 billion people on the planet. Artificial intelligence, computerisation, the digital age. We don't need 8 billion people to be wage slaves. So what's going to happen to all those people who are no longer needed in the productive process? We see this in Australia today, where we've got young people who've got no future. And even if they go to university, they come out with a HECS debt. They have no future. In an era where the climate emergency is becoming a real issue. No future. So what do we do? What do we do? Do we put them in concentration camps? Some people call them, youth justice system. Or do we somehow have a concept like a universal basic income? So that every Australian has a reasonable life, whether they want to be a wage slave or not. People think this is a radical idea. Not very radical at all. The Romans thought of it 2,000 years ago, when the increasing number of slaves made the plebeians, who had political power almost, unnecessary. But what did they do? They revolted. And that's where the old bread and circuses concepts come in. Now, what else am I interested in? Well, obviously, I'm interested in, cutting ties with the flailing USA empire. And obviously being a candidate in the electorate of Flinders, which is surrounded by the bay and the ocean. And obviously there are many properties there that are going to go underwater in the near future as climate change becomes more and more evident, the consequences, as Mr. the buffoon in Washington, expands coal industry in the US of A. Well, we begin to understand that there are issues. The climate emergency is real. And now we hear about epidemics in the land of the brave and the free. The list goes on and on. Look, if you're interested, and obviously you may be interested, you may not be interested, I'm not asking you to vote for me. I'm not asking you to vote for anybody. That's up to you. It's your vote, your choice. If you decide to participate in the parliamentary elections, good luck to you. But what I'm saying is that if you are interested, you can always go to the Facebook page, Toscano for Flinders, have a look at the policies I'm promoting. And it doesn't matter where you live, just share the policies, because this is about policies. This is about increasing revenue to ensure that every Australian leads a life free from the issues that face us on a day-to-day basis. We are the richest sovereign nation, state on planet Earth. But for far too long, we have allowed ourselves to be manipulated and exploited by the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange, communication. If you're in Melbourne on the 9th of April, that's tonight, turn up at Nurata Restaurant at the corner of Breeze, BRWSE, and Albion Street in Brunswick for dinner, starting at 6:30pm. If you're interested in the Toscano for Flinders campaign, pop along to the barbecue, whatever you want to call it. We're having a picnic, not a barbecue, a picnic we're having on this Saturday the 12th between midday and 3pm. Come along. It's next to the Village Green at Rosebud, across the road from the Rosebud Hotel, right next to the Rosebud Bowling Club. You can't miss it. Go to my Facebook page, Toscano for Flinders, or go to the other Facebook page, Joseph Toscano. All the information is there. If you're coming on Saturday, we'll see you there. Thank you for listening to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station. And remember, this is a time for celebration, not despair and despondency, because we are on the cusp of profound changes, and which way we will go ultimately depends on you. Are you part of the Gunner tribe? Are you part of the something should be something about that tribe? Or are you part of the tribe that is leaving the virtual world and entering the real world and being involved in activities and campaigns for real change for each and every one of us? Thank you for listening to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station. This program has been broadcast via the community radio network across the country. Please use any ideas you like. No copyright. It's all yours. Listen in to The Anarchist World this week, next week on your local community radio station.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.